that's my theme. Bilingual education is inclusion. It is not different from inclusion. Let's talk a bit, just a moment, about what we mean by bilingualism. I see people using it in many different ways. Sometimes it refers to a method of education, right? My method of education is bilingualism. I see that all the time here. Sometimes it refers to somebody who speaks two languages. I myself am bilingual. I speak Portuguese, ASL, and English. Notice there were three. I'm still bilingual. And it can also be a philosophy of education. People say, our school is a bilingual school. Okay? Now, these are actually different meanings for the same word. So I'd like to work a little bit on the notion of bilingualism as we move along. Because when we say a school is bilingual, it can mean a number of things. It can mean there are some children there whose parents do not speak the major language of the country. That's what bilingual schools mean in the United States. If you go to a grade school in the United States and you say, let me see your bilingual kid, they'll take you to the children who speak Spanish. So it means their parents don't speak English. It can mean children who speak more than one language, like my daughter. She's bilingual. She speaks Portuguese and English. It can mean a school in which everybody speaks more than one language. Or it can mean a school in which sometimes you speak one language and other times you speak another language. Like, for example, in some schools you do Spanish in the morning and English in the afternoon. So what a bilingual school is has these various meanings. The term inclusion is also very confusing. There are a lot of meanings for the word inclusion. It's very common for people to say, we have an inclusive school. Okay? And that's a philosophy of education. It means we want to educate everybody. But it means practically, usually, means the second thing. That we have inclusive classrooms. Okay? In a solid reality procedure. All right? Which means that you have, in each room, you have to have one example of every kind of kid. Right? That's the basic principle here. You have to have a kid in a wheelchair, you have to have a deaf kid, you have to have a blind kid, and then you have to have the non-including kids who are all normal human kids. So this notion of the inclusive classroom has become the dominant construction of inclusion in most countries. To UNESCO, inclusion is a human right, right? And Patty was talking about that a little earlier. Now, if you go to the documentation from UNESCO, which originated in what we call the Salamanca Statement, right? The Salamanca Statement on Inclusive Education. You see that the original notion of inclusion was the bottom thing. To fight discrimination and to make sure that all children got educated. So that everybody had access to the goods and the benefits of society. That's what inclusion is supposed to mean. Inclusion originally did not mean having one example of every kind of child in every classroom. It meant making education available to children who had been excluded before. If you look on the UNESCO website today, you'll see this. The ultimate goal of inclusive quality education is to end all forms of discrimination and foster social cohesion. So what does bilingualism have to do with inclusion? What do they have to do with deaf education? I was recently reading some work by a political philosopher named Agamben, who is very interesting because he talks about the notion of inclusion as growing from exclusion. He has a notion called inclusive exclusion. Think about that a minute. What he means is that the people who are defined as needing to be included only need to be included because they've been excluded. Okay? And that's really it's something to think about. It's something like what Ben was talking about this morning. We only define inclusion on the basis of difference from the norm. And inclusion only needs to be taken into account because of some characteristic that is excluded from mainstream society. There are a bunch of citations to this. I'll put my email up again at the end. You can write to me and I'll send it to you. So from this perspective then, inclusive education is the opportunity for excluded people to move into mainstream society. And so the notion of inclusion implies the adoption of mainstream behaviors and values. That's the price of inclusion. Is you're expected to lose the characteristic that got you excluded in the first place. So the simple solution then is we just say, okay, you're included, and the people disappear. The excluded people disappear, and they're included. Right? Nobody ever asked if the excluded people want to be included. Nobody ever asked if they have the capacity to be included. And when we talk about deaf people, we see that inclusion is a problematic thing for them in that sense. I just want to say one thing about bilingualism because I don't have much time. There are two notions of bilingualism. The top one, bilinguismo, has to do with using a person or a country a country or an institution in which there exists more than one language. The bottom one, bilingualidade, has to do with a person using two languages. And that's what we mean by bilingualism when we talk about deaf people. Deaf people have bilingualidade, or bilinguality in English. They use two languages. And when we focus on this need, then we are able to focus on a slightly different perspective on inclusion. Because bilinguality for deaf people is a fact. It's not a political question. Deaf people don't use sign language because they're political. Okay? Deaf people don't need to read because they're political. It's a fact of their life. And it's not a choice. And inclusion won't make deaf people into hearing people. So bilinguality remains a central fact in deaf education. The inclusive classroom actually creates exclusion for deaf people. Because deaf people don't have the physical capacity to be included in an inclusive classroom. And the people in the inclusive classroom don't have the capacity to talk to them so that they can be included. So, inclusion excludes deaf students. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the original UNESCO statement, they didn't talk about inclusive classrooms for deaf people. Here's what they said about deaf people. Owing to the particular communication needs, their education may be more suitably provided in special schools or special classes. In other words, deaf people are better educated exclusively. And UNESCO knew this.
The other thing UNESCO says is this. Curricula should not be adapted, curricula should be adapted to children's needs, not vice versa. And when we expect deaf children to adapt to an inclusive classroom, we're asking them to adapt to the curriculum rather than adapting the curriculum to them. So, the objective of this kind of inclusion that UNESCO talks about is to have an exclusive classroom for deaf children, which gives them the ability to have their bilingualism. And by virtue of that, includes them in the benefits of society. And from this perspective, then, and this is all I'm going to say, separate bilingual education for deaf children is inclusion. And we have to start telling the politicians this. It is inclusion, and it works. Tell them to come to Rio Branco and see. It works. That's it.